Annie did not want Helen to know that she was only a quick run from the house and her parents, so Annie had all the furniture moved around in the cottage. Then Annie and Helen went on a long ride in the carriage before arriving at the cottage. It worked. Helen thought she was in a new, strange place. Helen and Annie had many battles in the cottage. Annie would not let Helen eat until she was dressed. Helen refused to get dressed. Captain Keller watched through a window one day. He wanted to send Annie away, but the family talked him out of it, and it was lucky that they did. Over the next 2 weeks, Helen slowly began to change. She began to obey Annie. Then on April 5th, 1887, a miracle happened. Helen was washing the dishes. Annie spelled the word water in her hand. Helen did not react. The two went outside. At the water pump, Helen held her mug under the tap. Annie pumped out the cold water and spelled water in Helen's hand. Helen dropped the mug. A look of wonder filled her face. Helen spelled back water several times to Annie. Now, at last, Helen understood that words stood for things. Later in her autobiography, Helen wrote, "Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought." Annie spelled many different words into Helen's eager hands. Finally, Helen asked what to call Annie. Annie spelled teacher, and so Annie became teacher. At 7, Helen's world had opened at last. The wall had come down. Annie and Helen moved back to the main house. Helen made rapid progress. Annie saw that Helen loved to be outdoors, so most of their lessons were outside. Annie used the world around them to teach Helen. By the river, Helen learned geography. They dug canals and built mountains. For science, they studied nature. Helen soon knew many different plants and how they grew. Helen loved words and language. Helen memorized words easily. She learned nouns, verbs, and descriptive words. She began to understand abstract words, such as think. Helen could now talk to her family. Annie spelled what people said into Helen's hand. Then Helen replied. Mrs. Keller learned to speak with her fingers. Now she and Helen could talk. Even Captain learned to speak this way. By June, Helen knew about 400 words. Annie wrote to Mr. Anagnos. She told him of Helen's progress. Mr. Anagnos told the Boston newspapers about Helen. The papers ran stories about her. Readers wanted to know more about this deaf-blind child who was beautiful and smart. Most children Helen's age could read and write. Annie decided that Helen would learn to read and write too. Annie read books to Helen. She did this by spelling out the whole story in Helen's hand. Helen's world became filled with fairy tales, heroes, villains, myths, and legends. Annie taught Helen to write. She used a wooden writing board that had grooves on it. A paper was placed over the grooves. Helen then guided her pencil to form letters. This is how blind people learn to write. Helen had made great progress. She learned Braille, too. Braille is a system of writing for the blind. Soon Helen could read Braille books on her own. And so another world opened for Helen. Helen's life was much happier now, but she still had a temper. Helen had a name for herself when she lost her temper. She called herself the Phantom. but her tantrums came less and less often. Helen now liked playing with her little sister Mildred. Helen's mind was now free to learn, and her heart was free to love. Braille. Many blind people read by touch instead of sight. They run their fingers over pages that are printed in raised dots. Different arrangements of dots stand for different letters. Louis Braille invented this special kind of writing. Louis Braille was born in 1809 in a small town in France. He became blind at the age of 4. Most blind people then couldn't read or write. Many had to beg to make a living. But Louis was lucky. He went to a school for blind boys. He learned to read letters that were made by pressing copper wire into a sheet of paper to make a raised shape. Louis could read, but he still did not know how to write. Then one day a soldier came to the school. He showed the students a system called night writing. It helped soldiers in battle communicate with each other in the dark without having to talk. It was based on a series of raised dots. Louis was very excited by this new kind of writing. He saw how useful it could be. He experimented until he found a system of using 6 dots. Blind people could read it, and they could also write it. They used a stylus, a pointed pen-like tool, to make the dots. Today, Braille has been adapted for almost every language and is used all over the world. Mr. Anagnos asked Annie to write a paper about Helen. At nights, when Annie was at her desk writing, Helen sat quietly beside her writing her own letter to the blind children at Perkins. No one would have believed this quiet scene possible just 4 months earlier. Mr. Anagnos shared stories about Helen and Annie. The Boston newspapers ran more stories about them. The papers began calling Helen the Wonder Child. Readers wanted to meet her and know more about her. Some doubted if the stories could be true. Either way, Helen was becoming famous. Annie and Helen continued their lessons unaware of their growing fame up north. Christmas was coming. It would be the first time that Helen understood the holiday and would be able to take part in it. Helen and Annie read Christmas stories. They made up their own Christmas stories. Helen got caught up in the excitement and joy of the holiday. She loved making gifts and then dropping hints as to what the gifts were. The Keller family had much to be thankful for this holiday, and so did Annie, who at last had a home. The new year, 1888, dawned full of hope. Helen would turn 8, but more important, Helen would leave home that year. Helen wanted to visit Perkins, and Annie was going to take her there. But first, Helen had to prepare for the trip. Annie and Helen worked even harder at their lessons. Mrs. Keller worried that Helen was pushing herself too hard. Helen was often tired. She talked to Annie, but Annie said that she could not slow Helen down. Helen never wanted to rest. There was too much to learn. By May 1888, Helen was ready to go. But an amazing thing happened that changed their plans. Helen and Annie were invited to the White House to meet President Grover Cleveland. Like so many other people, the president was amazed by how much Helen could do. Most people thought that blind people would always be helpless. Many thought that, just because they could not see or hear, blind and deaf people were not smart. Helen proved to the President of the United States just how wrong that was.